Please join me in welcoming Alfred Alvarado and Timothy Hux, who are both threat researchers with Trellix, as they present Catch Me If You Can, Lowell Bins, and the adversaries who abuse them.
Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for attending our talk, Catch Me If You Can, Lowell Bins and the Adversaries that Abuse Them. My name is Alfred Alvarado. I will be your tour guide along with Tim as we travel through some of the Windows binaries and third-party tools we see being used and abused by threat actors. After we talk a little about each tool, we will go over some of the in-the-wild examples that we have seen used to either gain access, establish a foothold, or deploy additional payloads. The Windows binaries we will walk through may be suppressed by administrative settings, however they are part of a fresh OS install. The third-party tools we will go over may have originally been designed for administrative purposes or pen testing purposes, but often make an attacker's life easier when used with malicious intent. A little bit about myself. My career in information technology has allowed me to wear many hats in a few different sectors, ranging from healthcare, also government, insurance and banking, global manufacturing, and now part of the Trellix Threat Intelligence Group. So now I'll pass it over to Tim to introduce himself. But please remember, keep all arms and legs inside throughout our trip, as binaries and third-party tools may bite without warning. Yeah, I guess you didn't need that. You gonna keep those, or? Sorry.
Hello, my name is Tim Hux. I'm a threat researcher at the Trellix Threat Intelligence Group. In my cybersecurity career, I've supported multiple products across the Trellix portfolio related to endpoint, network, and threat intelligence. So here's the disclaimer slide we had to make sure we show you. The Threat Intelligence Group, we track hundreds of malware families and tools, including custom and commodity malware, information stealers, such as Redline and Raccoon, remote access Trojans, such as Async Rat and Remcos, loaders, Bumblebee and Xloader are a few examples, various crypto miners, XMRig, PureMiner. We also track the packers that are used, such as UPX and VM Protect, and then a whole list of ransomware families, including Conti, Lockbit, and Sodinokibi, for example. And we also track the legitimate tools in the Windows binaries, as we're going to be speaking of today. We also track threat actors, along with many of their given aliases. Currently, there are over 200 threat actors being tracked by the Threat Intelligence Group. For example, we track Mustang Panda, Muddy Water, TA505. As you can see up there, Fin7 is another one. And Lazarus, to name a few. Adversaries have used the binaries and tools that we're talking about today in attacks against organizations around the world, including government, defense, health, and the financial sectors, followed by aviation, energy, and information technology.
So Tim and I both work on the Trellix Insights platform. We gather information on global events. We vet IOCs and gather intelligence on the use of malware, non-malicious tools, and binaries, as well as the threat actors. The Insights platform contains a wide range of tools that we see used throughout threat hunting operations, which led to our team to develop a DISC scoring methodology with which we use to assign to indicators so that they may contribute to identifying tools discovered in an environment and give practitioners insight on what the tool is and if it may be a threat to their environment. Some of the tools and software packages receive tags that land them in a dual use or probably malicious category, because there may be some legitimate use for this tool, but if not inspected in the environment, may be cause for alarm. Other tags land in the range of malicious enabler. Now, these tools themselves may not infect a system, but do enable the system to be further compromised, either with an attachment that is drops an additional payload, or spawning a process that downloads an additional payload. The last two DISC scores we have here are reserved for malicious and destructive. They may give an attacker unfettered access to a machine, may be used to steal information, allow remote access, or inhibit use of the system. Once events are processed and events and indicators vetted, we identify behaviors based on the indicators and map them back to the MITRE ATT&CK matrix. Based on the data in the research, we identify the technique IDs from reconnaissance to impact, which are used to generate heat maps of the MITRE IDs within our Insights platform. The heat map shown here is compiled using technique IDs from the profiles we track in the Insights platform.
So OS native binaries, sometimes referred to as LOL bins. These binaries are often installed with the default installation of the Windows operating system. Along with examples, we will discuss the details around 4 of the more common OS binaries we saw on a regular basis in 2022. As you can see, they include PowerShell, WMIC, sometimes referred to as WEMIC, Schedule Task, and MSHTA or MISHTA, as some people call it. One of the most abused Windows binaries is PowerShell, which accounted for about 40% of the campaigns that we discovered or tracked in 2022. The command line and scripting tool is very adaptable and can be used throughout the entire infection lifecycle to perform multiple tasks. We've seen PowerShell can be used to download additional tools, disable security software, seek out credentials, and exfiltrate sensitive information. Threat actors that have abused PowerShell include the Lazarus and Gamma-Read APTs, the Lockbit and Sodinokibi ransomware groups, and Zloader and Bumblebee malware families. So in 2022, the Lazarus threat group attacked an energy company and used multiple PowerShell commands. The following commands were used by the APT group to download a malicious payload and communicate with a Cobalt Strike C2 server. So the first command downloaded a PowerShell file from a remote host, while the second PowerShell command communicated with a JavaScript file on a remote server over port 443. The malicious commands in these two examples map to the MITRE techniques as shown there on the screen, such as PowerShell. There's the obfuscation, web protocols, and the Ingress tool transfer. Another threat actor which used PowerShell in their attacks is the Sodinokibi ransomware group. The actors used PowerShell along with RunDLL32 during their reconnaissance phase of the attack. In that first example, the PowerShell commands was performed with the non-interactive and execution policy parameters, and then RunDLL32 along with the mini-dump interface was used to dump credentials to a zip file. Again, there's the MITRE techniques, PowerShell, run DLL32, and then the LSASS memory and the archive of the collected data. The second example are commands used by Sodinokibi in a separate campaign that we discovered. The ping command was used to send thousands of echo requests, which acted more like a sleep function, and that was to hinder analysis in a sandbox environment. The PowerShell command was then used to disable antivirus functions, which is very common with ransomware, while cert-util was renamed to cert.exe, and then used to decode the base64 encoded payload and then write the file to a working directory. The end of the command deleted the files to hinder analysis, and then it started the process to drop the ransomware. And again, you can see the MITRE techniques of Windows Command Shell. There's the time-based evasion, PowerShell, the disabling of the tools, the deobfuscation, and then ending with the file deletion. So WMIC, or WMIC, is a software utility that allows users to perform WMI operations with a command prompt. The Windows binary is abused by threat actors to execute malicious commands and payloads, as well as gather data. Attacks using WMIC accounted for about 21% of the campaigns that we processed last year. Groups and malicious operators using WMIC include APT29, APT41, APT37, and the Lockbit and Sodinokibi ransomware groups. So how did they use it? So in 2022, the tool was used by the threat actors behind a Lockbit ransomware campaign to delete shadow copies hindering data recovery, which, if you know anything about ransomware, that's very common as well. The first command shows not only the WMIC tool being used, but also the use of CMD, VSS admin, and BCD edit. The command starts by deleting the volume shadow copies, and then uses BCD edit to disable automatic repair on the infected system. Again, the MITRE techniques of Windows Command Shell, the inhibit of system recovery, and then WMI. The WMIC tool was also used along with RunDLL32 in Sodinokibi ransomware campaigns to deploy a Cobalt Strike beacon. That second command shows the use of WMIC connecting to an internal IP, and then using RunDLL32 to create the malicious beacon. And again, the MITRE techniques of WMI, RunDLL32, and then the Windows admin shares. WMIC has also been used in a campaign carried out by APT37 for recon. In the example, you can see WMIC gathering a range of system information around the disk and the file system, including the description, drive type, free space, the size, and the volume name. And again, the malicious commands mapped to the MITRE techniques as shown: Windows Command Shell, WMI, and system information discovery.
Okay, so another Windows binary that is commonly abused is the Windows Task Scheduler. Of the events we analyzed over the last year, roughly about 20% of them contained some sort of scheduled task. Of the events, either an automated payload was deployed, scripts were ran to retrieve a payload, or performing system checks to identify a location, verify previous compromise, or exfiltrate data, or may have been used to reinfect a machine. This may allow attackers to focus on other phases of their attack, additional victims, maintain persistence, and a hands-off approach to payload execution. Actors we have seen abusing the scheduled task include Mustang Panda, also Bronze Butler, and APT41. In these examples here, we can see that TA558 utilized a task scheduler to create a scheduled task named Spotify. The task was set to execute every 10 minutes. The service masquerading as Spotify was then used to execute and initiate a download via the MSHTA binary. In this specific instance, a VBS file was retrieved that led to an async rat infection. A couple of the identified MITRE technique IDs included the scheduled task, of course, masquerading as a task or a service, as well as MSHTA, and web protocols and ingress tool transfer. Our second example, the threat group identified as Holy Ghost, used the schedule task command to first identify any additional tasks that were named locker task, delete and recreate the task, and then this allowed the threat actor to maintain persistence and eventually execute a ransomware payload via the same task. And in that particular campaign, you can see that there was Windows CMD was used to then kick off the scheduled task. Next, we have MSHTA or MISHTA. In the last example, we also saw that MISHTA binary was used with scheduled task. However, it can be used with additional binaries and scripts as well. MISHTA is another Windows binary that was intended to execute HTML applications or HTA files. It may also be spawned from files containing embedded and obfuscated commands and URLs. In some of the events we have seen, Visual Basic scripts and JavaScripts have contained these obfuscated commands and URLs that get deobfuscated and spawn the MSHTA binary. And then that is used to retrieve additional payloads or config files from the attacker's C2, which may allow them quietly to creep by security settings. Of the events analyzed, over 8% have abused MISHTA and have involved groups such as Lazarus, Gamma Readin, and APT36. In our example here, we see the threat actor known as Kim Suki used the MISHTA binary in an event targeting South Korea. An interesting thing about this example, the threat actor tried to obfuscate the commands by concatenating it and adding a plus sign. Piecing it all together, we can see MSHTA was used to download a PHP file located on the attacker's web resource, and then the script was used to sleep for 90 seconds, and then finally call a task kill process to kill the MSHTA process. A couple of the technique IDs we see here, Windows Command Shell, web protocols, as well as service stop. Next, we have the Gamma Readin group. They're also known as Armageddon or UNC10. They used the MISHTA binary to execute a remote XML file. MISHTA was spawned and called PowerShell, which kicked off a series of tasks that eventually executed the remote XML file. In the end, the event resulted in the GammaLoad malware infection, which targeted users in Ukraine. A couple of the technique IDs we see here, same Windows Command Shell, web protocols, and the MSHTA binary.
So in the next section, we will dive into some of the third-party tools abused by adversaries in 2022. These legitimate utilities are used for a variety of reasons by system and network administrators to carry out routine tasks, but are often taken advantage of by adversaries for anything from remote administration to information stealing, exfiltration, and as well as reconnaissance. So some of the top tools in our collection that we've seen throughout 2022 include Mimikatz, rclone, PSExec, ADFine, ProcDump, and Lazan or Lasagna. The Trellix Threat Intelligence Group has recorded over 100 attacks using the Mimikatz utility. The tool has been used by numerous threat actors for many years to acquire credentials from the Windows Credential Manager, LSAS memory, and the SAM table. Mimikatz has also been used by adversaries for, again, privilege escalation, defense evasion, persistence, and the lateral movement as well. Mimikatz was used in about 10% of the campaigns that we processed or recorded in 2022. Adversaries who have abused Mimikatz include the Gamma Readin group, Lazarus, APT41, APT29, and then, like I said, the groups behind Soden, Akibi, Lockbit, and the Ryuk ransomware families. APT41 used Mimikatz to dump passwords from LSAS memory and then use the stolen information to move laterally around the network. The first command starts by using the privilege debug to get debug rights, which is required for many of the Mimikatz commands that you run. Next, the Mimikatz logon passwords full module was called to list all available provider credentials, which typically shows recently logged on users and computer credentials. The command then saves the output to log.txt under the C drive. The second command shows the same actor using the credentials to perform a pass the hash attack to move across the network. The command starts with the Mimikatz pass the hash module, and then uses the user, domain, NTLM, and run parameters to carry out the attack. You can see there the malicious commands in these examples map to the MITRE techniques of, again, pass the hash and the LSAS memory. Next, we'll move on to rclone. The legitimate rclone utility is used to back up, restore, mirror, and migrate data to and from cloud storage. We've seen quite a few threat groups have used rclone to aid in the exfiltration of sensitive data from infected devices. So attacks using rclone accounted for about 10% of the campaigns in 2022. Adversaries have used rclone for almost every ransomware family that we can think of, including Conti, as well as TrickBot and the Silent and Royal ransomware groups. In 2022, threat actors exploited the Log4 shell vulnerability to drop ransomware, as well as still sensitive information. Several tools and malicious software were used to carry out the campaign, including rclone. And the first example shows rclone, which was renamed to update.txt, exfiltrating data to a Dropbox location. In another example, the tool was renamed to medius.exe and used for data exfiltration. The command also excluded files with specific extensions from exfiltration, including MP4, EXEs, DLLs, and others. Another example of rclone being used was in a Conti ransomware attack. The campaign started with a bizarre liver infection accomplished by a phishing campaign that distributed weaponized documents. Before encrypting files, the threat actor used rclone to exfiltrate data to a legitimate cloud service. The command started with by copying files that were no more than 2 years old to a share on a remote server. The command also used the multi-thread streams parameter. That's to set the number of threads that are used during the copy. That was to limit the bandwidth to 10 megabits per second. And again, you can see the MITRE techniques of the web protocols and then the exfiltration to cloud storage. Also seen being abused by threat actors is the PSExec utility. PSExec is a free Microsoft tool that can be used to create accounts on remote systems, escalate privileges to system, download and upload a file over network share, and also execute commands on remote devices. The tool was used in over 60 APT and ransomware campaigns tracked by the Threat Intelligence Group. Attacks using PSExec accounted for close to 10%, about 9 or 10% of the campaigns in 2022. So some of the groups and malicious operators you can see have used PSExec that include Lockbit, Fin7, APT41, and Vice Society, the ransomware group. The example on the right there shows a simple PSExec command used during a Lockbit ransomware campaign. The threat actor leveraged PSExec to pivot from one server to another. Again, you can see the MITRE techniques of Windows Command Shell and service execution. The command on the left was using a Conti ransomware campaign to distribute a Cobalt Strike beacon via PSExec. The command started by copying a Cobalt Strike beacon to the admin share on a remote system, and then PSExec was used to distribute that beacon throughout the environment. The run DLL 32 Windows binary that shown is that's the parent process that was leveraged in the command. And again, you can see the minor techniques of Windows command shell, Windows admin shell, shares, and then lateral tool transfer, and then again, run DLL 32.
Okay, so let's look at AD-Find. Now, AD-Find was originally developed to be a better tool to query Active Directory, and it is freely available for download. It is yet another example of a tool that may have been developed for good intentions that was abused by threat actors with malicious intent. AD-Find is used to gather information in discovery operations, which attackers can gather the information to be used in additional phases of their attack, such as creating running processes with elevated privileges, as well as to deploy malware with elevated privileges. In the past events analyzed, AD-Find has been in roughly about 3% of these events and been tied to activities that involved the Lazarus group, the Conti group, Fin12, and Exotic Lily. Additionally, some of the payloads deployed prior to or after the use of AD-Find have included the Bumblebee Loader, ransomware families including Ryuk, ReEvil, or Lockbit. In this event, they dropped the Bumblebee Loader at initial access. Later, we see AD-Find being used on multiple occasions. Initially to discover Active Directory users and machines. Then again, the actor came back and used it to discover security groups. And lastly, on their third use of AD-Find, they were seen discovering domain trusts. Once targeted information was obtained, the information was written to temp files, which may have been used for additional tasks and exfiltrated for further use. Some of the MITRE technique IDs we see here are the Windows command shell, remote system discovery, and domain trust discovery. Like the other tools, ProcDump started with a legitimate use. It is a command line utility that is used to generate crash dumps during system spikes. Now, the dump files are used by administrators and developers to try and determine the cause of the spike. However, in the hands of attackers, it has been abused to identify running processes, especially those that may contain passwords. Through the events analyzed, ProcDump has been seen in about 3% of the events used by threat actors, including Lazarus and APT41. In those events, additional payloads that were used prior or post ProcDump included Bumblebee Loader, Black Cat, and Conti ransomwares. So how can something to monitor system spikes be used to do bad things? Our first example in an event that was done by an unattributed threat actor, the ProcDump 64 is executed. It was dropped to the machine and executed. Commands were issued to execute the payload, including the parameters to accept the EULA, which was followed by the MA parameters to generate a full dump of the system LSAS process memory and then write it to a file. In our second example here, we see that the Antillean APT group used the ProcDump file in pretty much the same way, except they tried to bypass detection by changing the executable name to upload.exe. They additionally accepted the EULA, created a full dump of the LSAS process memory, and called for its content to be written to a DMP file. Now, in those two examples, we have the LSAS memory technique ID being used. So there really is no strict naming convention when it comes to threat actors, malware events, or even campaigns. So we take a look at the utility called Lasagna. Okay, it's not the tasty Italian dish, but an open source credential recovery project. It boasts capabilities to perform credential dumping from memory, also from MS Cache, obtaining passwords from browsers, social media platforms, as well as databases and mail clients. It has the ability to obtain Wi-Fi parameters as well as recover credentials from the Mac OS keychain, as well as running Linux processes. Although the project has been active for some time and has accounted for 2% of events, it is sometimes an unknown application that resides in an environment unnoticed. So getting down to the meat and cheese of the tool, we have Sing Lasagna used in events carried out by APT34, Muddy Water, and Team TNT. After Lasagna had served its purpose, the threat actors that made use of it later dropped ransomware payloads from the REvil or Black Cat ransomware families. Some real-world examples how Lasagna was leveraged by these threat actors. In an event that eventually led to a Conti ransomware deployment, Lasagna was executed in the Windows command shell and used to gather credentials, which were then written to a text file that were either retrieved manually by the attacker or exfiltrated via some other task. We can see the Windows command shell technique ID here, as well as OS credential dumping and data staged. Our last example here, we have Lasagna, which was executed with administrative privileges, and it was used to query the registry for passwords that may be in the SAM system and security files, which were then written to text files as well in the temp directory. And the command line examples the technique ID examples we have here are the Windows command shell, the query registry, as well as credentials in the registry.
So defense and countermeasures. So for today's presentation, we're going to show a few of the countermeasures and to help defend against the attacks that we discussed. There's also many Yara and Sigma rules available on our GitHub that's out there, as well as across the security industry to help with threat hunting. There's also many snort rules available on the internet to assist with network-based attacks. I'll go over a few of the defense measures to help with what we discussed today. So for PowerShell, you can implement least privilege on who can run PowerShell commands, turn on PowerShell logging and monitor for Windows Event IDs 400 and 403. You can also configure and deploy the logging of PowerShell script block execution, and then monitor for Windows Event ID 4104. So for WEMIC, restrict all users, if it's possible, from connecting remotely to WMI. You can also block execution of code through application control and or script blocking. For scheduled tasks, configure your endpoint security application to prevent processes from modifying startup registry locations. You can also configure scheduled tasks to run under an authenticated account instead of system. And also monitor for Windows Event IDs 4698, 4699, 4700, and 4701 for the creation, deletion, enabling, and disabling of scheduled tasks. For Mishta, configure endpoint security applications to prevent Mishta from being started by any process. You can also, to keep users from unintentionally double-clicking on a malicious HTA attachment, you can change the default applications for files with a HTA extension from mishta.exe to a plain text editor such as Notepad. For rclone, monitor for new network connections and data exfiltration to cloud storage. And you can also monitor for the rclone commands such as rclone sync, copy, cat, move, and rclone check. So for PSExec, you can monitor for the execution of payloads or commands on a remote host or the creation of a new service on a remote system. And you can also monitor for Windows Event IDs 4689, 5145, and 7045 for the creation, starting, stopping, and usage of PSEXC SBC. So for AD Fine, to help mitigate the use of AD Fine, keep AD trust relationships to a minimum and employ network segmentation. You can also monitor processes for the creation of adfine.exe. And then again for Mimikatz and ProcDump and Lasagna, since those are all password retrieval and credential dumping tools, you can monitor for the opening of the Security Accounts Manager or SAM database on the local file system, monitor for the accessing of the SAM system and security registry keys, monitor for unexpected processes interacting with lsas.exe, and then also monitor for the creation of .dmp files. So, Alfred.
All right, so to summarize, we continue to see the increase of Windows binaries and third-party tools being abused by threat actors. Today, we barely scratched the surface on some of them being used that we see throughout our threat hunting process. But again, the Trellix Insights platform continues to grow as we track and build profiles around threat actors and the malicious and non-malicious tools that they use. We map all those back to the MITRE framework, provide details on vetted events, which may include real tool use examples, and share those details via the Trellix Insights platform. We can open it up for questions as time permits. However, Tim and I will be here throughout the remainder of RSA, and you might catch us talking about some of the data in the Trellix quarterly threat report at the Trellix booth today. And if anybody has any questions, please step up to the microphone, and we will try our best to answer the questions you have. Okay. Well, we can close it up. Thank you guys again for coming, and
Thank you.
hope you enjoyed.